This term we are focusing on poetry anthology. Our theme is New Zealand. There are 4 parts to this task: the annotated poem, the personal response, 3 poems you have written yourself, and an animated visual poem that you have created. Let's look at the annotated poem in more detail. Firstly, you need to find a well-written poem about New Zealand. You will need to read through this poem, underlining and highlighting poetry techniques. Next to each of these, you will then need to add a text box which comments on the purpose and the effect of each poem. You will then create a voiceover in the form of a commentary to go with your annotation as you explain how the poet has used figurative language and sound techniques to create meaning. You will need to write a commentary discussing the poem that you've annotated. This commentary needs to be in the form of a voiceover explaining how and why the poet has used a variety of figurative language techniques and sound techniques. You will need to explain the effects of the figurative techniques and the sound techniques on the reader. You can use these 4 questions as a template to help you put your annotated poem commentary together. Here is an example of an annotated poem, Island Man by Grace Nichols. This is an annotated poem because the figurative language techniques and sound techniques have been highlighted and underlined. They have been identified. There are then text boxes that are used with arrows to show where these figurative language and sound techniques are, and in the text box it explains the effect that these figurative language techniques and sound techniques have on the poem. For example, the poet has used personification to describe the sun. The sun surfaced defiantly. This helps the reader picture the sun as if it's a living being, the sun as if it is defiantly coming up out of the ocean. The second part of your poetry anthology is the personal response. Here is where you need to record your opinion on the poem that you've annotated. You can use these starters to help you with your personal response. The third part to your poetry anthology is to write 3 poems yourself. The choices are a rotation poem, a haiku, or a poem of your choice from a variety of poetry forms. You will be reading these poems in the form of a voiceover and including pictures, words on screen, images and sound to make sure that your poems are interesting when you present it in your poetry anthology. The rotation poem. This will be done in class together. Each student will find a New Zealand themed poem. You will then copy the 5th line. You will then go around the class and gather up 5 lines and make a new poem from the lines that you have collated. The second poem is the haiku. This is a Japanese poem. Read the instructions as to how many syllables each line is required. An example is, I am first with 5, then 7 in the middle, 5 again to end. Write your own haiku about New Zealand. The third poem is a poem choosing the form of your choice. Please make sure that you choose a poetry form that is longer than 3 lines. It needs to show that you're able to use figurative language techniques and sound techniques to effect. The fourth and last part of the poetry anthology is your visual poem. Check out Billy Collins' link to his visual poems. To do this, you will need to choose one of your poems and make an animated film that goes with the poem. Your visuals need to match what the poem is about. Suggested apps are listed. It is recommended that you plan your poetry anthology carefully. You could use storyboarding to do this. You can plan the order of the 4 tasks, what music and sound techniques you'll use to go along with each task, what transitions you'll use to ensure that the poetry anthology is fast and keeps the audience's attention. What pictures will you use? Will you use words on screen to match what you are saying? You can also plan your dialogue and the voiceover. This is a storyboard template which could help you plan each of the 4 parts of the poetry anthology. I suggest that you have 4 of these to make sure that your poetry anthology is of the highest standard. Well done. Now let's go through the checklist to make sure that we've completed every aspect that needs to be included in our poetry anthology. Have you chosen a New Zealand poem and annotated it? Have you included a personal response? Have you written 3 of your own poems and recorded these with visuals to match? And finally, have you made an animated film poem?